My viewers are fantastic. One of you has reached out who works for Boeing and explains how door plugs really work and why the Alaskan one failed. So door plugs are there to save airlines money because there's an exit door behind the wing, and if you don't need it, why pay for an exit door, which is expensive and works perfectly, when you can have just a plug filling the hole. So Boeing only make one MAX 9 fuselage with holes for doors behind the wing. And if you don't want those doors, you fill it with a plug. But for flexibility, those plugs can actually be removed by maintenance if you need to put in a row of seats or have access to the fuselage. That plugging and removing the plug option must have given Boeing engineers a nightmare. So they came up with this. This is just a plug. It is not a door. It only fills the hole. And it works like this, with a whole bunch of built-in redundancy, you would hope. First of all, this plug, not a door, is on these tracks that look a bit like a question mark. Here's one of them. There's 4 of these tracks. And to remove the door, if you need to, you have to follow the shape of this path with the pins. When the plug is fully closed and seated, there's an overlap, so there's metal actually overlapping the fuselage and a gasket to seal it in. Alaska did actually find that there was a pressurization leak on their 737 MAX 9. I think it was coming from one of the door plugs because it had moved. The next thing that keeps it in are these 6 pads, both on the plug and on the fuselage, and they have to fit together. And aircraft are pressurized, and this plug is inside the fuselage, so the pressure of the cabin is actually going to help it seal. And that pressure keeps these 6 pads on the 6 pad seats very firmly. But this is the big point. Occasionally, it would be great to take the plug out to have access to their cabin. Let's go over how you take one of these plugs out. Well, first of all, you have to take out these 4 retaining bolts. 2 of them go through the top pins, and 2 of them go through something called the springs, which we'll get onto in a minute. These are bolts with nuts. Bolts with nuts fail. Any bolt or nut fixture on an airplane, a ship, or on your car will fail. You don't want to have fixtures of nuts and bolts. There's 2 very possible failure modes caused by the same thing, and that's vibration. When something vibrates, like your car engine or an airplane, the nut tends to unscrew under vibration and pop off. And then the bolt can go plop. Car manufacturers today avoid all fasteners if they can. You spot weld or bond things together. You do not bolt them together with nuts and bolts because they unscrew. But there's a magic formula to stop that happening. It's made by Henkel. It's called Loctite, and that's a thread retaining. And you'll see Loctite on anything that vibrates because nuts and bolts fail. But the aviation industry don't always want to use Loctite. They do use Loctite, but in this case, they want to be able to take the plug out and put it back without replacing all the bolts, because you can't really use a bolt twice with Loctite. You can, but it's not industry standard. So what airplane manufacturers have come up with, and it's a standard aviation thing, is castellated bolts. These little places that you fire bows and arrows out of a castle. There's a pin through the nut, through the bolt, and you put a cotter pin, a split pin, which you put through and wind back against the castellation. That means you, with needle nose pliers, can bend them back, pull out the pin, take off the nut, and when you want to put it back, you can just put a new pin in. That makes the nut and bolt much more secure and means it's reusable. Win-win. So I'm asking you right now to take out the door plug. So you take out the pins, you undo the nuts, you pull out the bolts, then what do you do? Well, the door is heavy and it's held in this track, but you've got another safety feature you have to overcome. And here it is. These are the springs at the bottom of the door. The door is held up into position. The pads are lined up, so it's sealed. To unseal it and to remove it, you have to take the door and push it down against the springs, down, out and down, so you're compressing the springs. You pull it down, the pads then separate. Bonk! The door then moves out to the outside of the plane and goes whoop. 20 to 30 centimeter little retaining straps keep the door from falling onto the ground, so it's just gone whoop outside the aircraft, and there's a hinge on the bottom. So what happened in the Alaskan flight? I think there's 3 possible failure modes and a big clue before the actual flight took off. Before the flight took off, they had a pressurization alert. That was because I think that the door plug was actually moved down a bit. Those pads were right on the edge of catching. It was holding, but the seal around the door was compromised. That gasket was leaking. So when they pressurized the plane, but they flew it anyway. Not good. What I think happened in flight is right on the edge of the pads holding and the door moving down against the springs, it eventually in the turbulence went poof, separated from the pads, flew out, the springs moved it upwards, it then exited the aircraft to about 20 centimeters. The retaining straps broke, badonk, the door fell down, ripped off the hinge, and here you can clearly see the hinge left on the fuselage and separated from the aircraft, causing explosive decompression, and the plug ended up in this man's garden. So the $6 million question, why did it happen? Well, it's only in my humble opinion. NTSB will find out. But I think either there weren't any retaining bolts, or somehow the castellation had failed, the pins weren't in it and it undid, or metal fatigue, the bolts cracked under vibration, or worrying the whole hinge assembly wasn't screwed on tightly enough and the whole thing separated. I don't have enough information, but I hope you now know how you can remove a door plug. I think there's another big problem that we're ignoring. These door plugs are behind a piece of plastic, the fuselage wall that you sit your head against when you're flying. So if it's moved, if there's an issue with this door plug, you don't see it. The crew on a walk around wouldn't see that it had moved down, that it was leaking air, that there was a loose nut or bolt, because it's behind a sheet of plastic. I think it's really stupid. If I was an airline, which I'm not, buying a MAX 9, which I wouldn't, I would actually have the doors fitted. Doors are very expensive and they work and they've got, safety overrides. They're good. These plugs are hidden away. If anything was loose, if anything had failed, you wouldn't know. There's no way of checking it until it goes whoopee-doo and becomes unplugged. The truth will come out. NTSB are excellent. They'll find out what's happening. Boeing, please pull your socks up. We need trust in you as airline passengers. We need you to actually fit proper doors and not plugs in these MAX 9s. Hope you found that interesting. If you did, give it a thumbs up, subscribe. I've got loads of films on interesting engineering and flying saucers on my channel, which you might enjoy. Thanks for watching.